Hi, Steve.
Hey, Bob. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well.
Well, welcome to Blogging Heads TV.
Thank you. I'm the wrong couse, I'm afraid.
Well, look, we'll find out who is the wrong couse. I should say, by way of introduction, that first of all, leaving aside the fact that you're a couse, you're an attorney. You've also taught law at various law schools, I guess, and you sometimes blog about legal affairs for the Huffington Post.
Occasionally.
And then in addition to all those accomplishments, yes, you are the brother of a co-founder of Blogging Heads TV, Mickey Couse.
Yes. I'm definitely on his coattails here today, I would say.
Oh, I don't. No. We administered a standardized test nationwide to every citizen.
What
a
coincidence!
You got the highest score.
What a coincidence!
Yeah.
Well, you know, I can't match Mickey with his Hollywood parties at all.
Well,
I live in Berkeley.
Yeah, well, there are famous people in Berkeley. There's you.
There are. Sunday, it is my belief that I swam in a pool in the lane next to John Yoo, who is one of our more infamous residents.
Wow. I'm afraid. And you were allowed to swim in the pool? I mean, nobody arrested you? He didn't have you arrested for swimming in his pool?
I thought the water would turn some strange color or disappear or turn red, I thought.
Do people know who John Yoo is exactly?
Well, people have told me that he goes to the same club I do. I had never seen him before. I think it was him. My friend David Coleman says that he's never seen him swim before, but by the side of the pool was a book called The American Presidency and the Politics or something like that. So that, I thought, was confirming.
Sounds like the guy. Now, he's famous for helping the administration formulate some of the legal opinions that had a kind of a repressive effect on certain activities, I guess. I mean, in the wake of 9/11, wasn't he one of the architects of the of policies that civil libertarians complain about? He
was their useful idiot. He seems to have written incredibly incorrect and authoritarian, pro-torture, the president can do anything memos at will. And the whole while he was a professor at Bolt, where I went to school, where he has tenure. And he actually seems to be quite popular there. When I talk to other professors or the dean, they defend him as a member of their faculty, even though they claim that, well, many of them obviously don't agree with him. But he's an embarrassment to the school. He was sort of the counterpoint.
And that's the Berkeley Law School, University of California Law School?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
So he's the one, I forget... you know, this whole business about Ashcroft at his hospital bed and this big fight within the administration over the legality. He was the apparently most stalwart in favor of all these wiretapping things.
Yeah, Ashcroft was resisting the constraints on civil liberties that the administration favored, and so... And he was ailing and in the hospital, and so the administration sent some team to kind of get him to sign off on something, right? Because he was still Attorney General.
Right. He wasn't Attorney General.
He wasn't.
Comey was Attorney General, and that was what Ashcroft had the guts to tell them. But Cheney and his man Addington, and then you, as their scribe, were the ones who were staking out the position that even Ashcroft couldn't swallow.
Okay, so, I mean, we should say, and people may be getting this picture already, there are some areas where your ideology contrasts with your brother, Mickey's.
I think I'm a paleo-liberal.
And rather than try to kind of characterize that, I guess we can just let it emerge in the course of the conversation.
That's fine.
And then toward the end of the conversation, I want to ask you some questions about Mickey himself and to try to shed some light on the enigma that is Mickey. But the one thing I wanted to get clear at the beginning is you are older than Mickey, is that right?
I'm 3 years older, yes.
So you were his role model.
I don't know. I don't think so. Mickey was during school certainly was a better student. He was student body president of Beverly Hills High School, where I believe his main claim to fame was putting the Velvet Underground on at a assembly at 10:30 in the morning, which may not have gone that well, but it was I thought a brave effort. But anyway, I don't think I'm his role model. We're brothers. We get on fine. I don't want to disappoint you. There's no enmity between us. But frankly, you spent more time with him over the last 35 years than I have, by quite a bit.
Well, yeah, I mean, adult relations between siblings are a funny thing, and I haven't gotten much FaceTime with my brother, but it's still possible that more than you know, you influenced him as he was growing up. I mean, and it may be, I mean, I don't want to suggest that you're kind of in denial here, but it may be that that's a heavier moral burden than you're really prepared to accept. And I got to say, you know, I mean, if I were like, if it were Judgment Day and I were standing at the pearly gates and God said, what did you accomplish in your life? And I, you know, said, well, I was Mickey Kouse's role model, you know.
I'm taking the fifth. But you know, we should tease this and make people stay the whole hour, don't you think?
Yeah, okay, we won't get into this. But until the end, until the bitter end, okay.
But it's true that the reason I'm blogging is that Mickey got tired of me sending him angry emails telling him what a right-winger he was, and so he arranged for me to be able to write for the Huffington Post.
Yeah, okay. So that basic difference is on the table.
Yes.
Now let's flesh it out in detail. Well, first let me tell you, how is the life of a part-time blogger? How have you found that?
Well, it's interesting. Most people are. When Mickey first started doing this, and he was sort of, you know, a pioneer. Nobody even knew what a blogger was. I'd say my brother was a blogger, and they'd look at me blankly. Now I suppose it's entered the lexicon. My experiences have been interesting. I once was on the Brian Lehrer show after I blogged, and
that's a local New York NPR show, a much listened to morning NPR show in New York.
So I think I flunked though. They called about 5 minutes earlier than I expected it, and I hadn't fully dressed yet. And they said the phone in my office wasn't good enough, so I came down to the kitchen where they rang immediately. And I found myself doing an hour on the telephone with Juan Williams, wearing no pants, unable to get a glass of water, and about halfway through, the cat came in and started meowing for food. So
did you mention these things to them that
well,
like you weren't wearing any pants?
That's the difference between blogging heads.
I was just going to say.
I'll reveal at the end of this.
Feel free to say things like that on Blogging Heads TV.
I'll reveal it at the end, I think. But,
well, just reveal it in the sense of talking about it, okay?
I understand. That's a good point. Mickey did enough of that.
Even Blogging Heads TV has standards.
We had enough with Mickey's ersatz scar. But it is possible that Peanut Butter the cat will come in and meow for food at some point.
That's a nice name, Peanut Butter.
My son picked that.
Oh, okay. So you've got kids. Good. So you should be the conservative one, and he should be the liberal. But anyway. I
don't have to grow up if I have kids, right?
What's that?
Contrary to Ann Althouse's theories on child rearing, I don't believe one has to totally grow up just because one has kids.
No, and in some ways they keep you young, you know?
Yes, that's right.
It's kind of a mixture.
That's right. Well, was there any news yesterday?
There was a little bit in your neck of the woods, because it's a legal matter. As you may have heard, the president decided to commute the sentence of Scooter Libby.
Yeah, what a surprise.
Well, it was in the sense that some people thought he might pardon him, and there were people who thought he would not incur the political cost of doing either of those things, right? But I mean, his hope had clearly been that he could put the whole thing off until the end of his administration, when he was about to leave anyway. But then the judiciary said, no, sorry, we're going to send this guy to jail right now, so Bush had to make a decision.
Well, first of all, let me say I don't agree with making him serve his time before the appellate process is finished. I don't see, I've read the briefs. I frankly don't know whether Judge Walton is correct or not on the three major points they've raised. But I don't see how they're not close questions, and I don't understand why he should serve his jail time before they're decided. That doesn't make any sense to me. But having said that, I see the prosecution of Scooter Libby for a piece of perjury that, even after reading Fire Dog Lake in just 1 minute pretty assiduously, I think is pretty inexplicable. I think his function is to get at Cheney. And I think that's the concern of the administration, and I think that that's why there was such a change in the defense tactics. They announced Cheney was going to testify, and they were going to show what was going on, and then all of a sudden that all evaporated, and they didn't do any of it. And I think the quid pro quo is that something like this was going to happen, and they would have liked to have waited till what I'll call Mark Rich time at the end of the administration, but they couldn't because he was going off to prison, and so they had to do this. So To me,
so wait, you think that they're giving this to Libby in exchange for keeping him quiet? Is that what you're saying,
yeah.
or?
Well, I don't think there's any question that's what's happening. Whether the extent to which it was discussed, I guess we're not allowed to know, because we're not allowed to know what either the president or the vice president say during their entire 8 years in office.
And you're saying that the beans he would spill are about Cheney?
I think so. I think there's pretty clear that Cheney orchestrated this attempt to rebut Joseph Wilson that included the questionable statement that his wife was the one who, quote, sent him to Niger. And that it had to involve explaining who his wife was and why she was in that position, which certainly was improper. I mean, there's no question she was undercover in the common use of that term, and may have violated, the Espionage Act or the other laws that apply to this.
May have. I mean, I do think the initial allegation was a little hyperbolic, and I don't mean the legal allegation, but in the sense that I don't think that Cheney et al. Were trying to retaliate against Wilson by disclosing that his wife was in the CIA. I think it was a straightforward attempt to discredit his witness,
right,
what he said about the thing, by suggesting that the only reason he got the Niger job was not on grounds of merit, but just because his wife was in the CIA.
Right,
So
she was collateral damage, but if you read Hubris, you see that she appears to have been a pretty key person in our attempts to deal with weapons in Iraq, and so that was collateral damage also. And I think a good case could be made that it violated the Espionage Act or the Intelligence Identities Protection Act, although there's some technicalities.
It could still have violated that, and that's why having an investigation was not a crazy idea, it seems to me.
Right.
And in any event, where I come down is, look, it was perjury, and that should be a serious thing. And one problem I have with the commutation is if Bush says, okay, the verdict was valid, there was perjury. He did, I guess, obstruct justice. I don't know whether that's technically the term or not. But
why are you taking this seriously? I mean, why are you taking seriously what some public relations team put together for Bush to read?
Well, I mean, when politicians say things, we subject them to scrutiny.
Yeah, but you don't think that Bush thinks that Libby committed perjury, do you?
Oh, I think he could well think that. Why do you think Bush couldn't think that?
Because there's no indication that Bush would be sensitive to that sort of thing. I'm sure he thinks it was a misrecollection. Well, I don't know. I'm not. I mean, if he thinks he committed perjury, then he's accepting the fact that there was a plot in the Cheney office to deceive the investigator, and then he should be concerned with Cheney. I don't think anybody thinks Scooter Libby just went off on his own and made up some story on purpose that he thought shielded the vice president without consulting with the vice president and not as part of some plan. I mean, why would that happen?
I don't know. I don't know the facts of the case well enough to know for sure what is implied by the assertion that he committed perjury. I'm sure he did commit perjury, and I suspect there was either an explicit or implied agreement with Cheney, as you suggest, that, hey, this is how we're going to play this, I'm going to do this to protect the team, and so on. What's going on in Bush's head is such a profound mystery to me that I don't even want to speculate, but I mean, one thing I do think is, if Bush is saying, yes, he committed perjury, the verdict was valid, but the appropriate penalty for that is a $250,000 fine. Now, that to me is offensive because, for one thing, it just belittles the crime of perjury. Secondly, it says that it's a crime that affluent people are allowed to do, right? I mean, $250,000 to Libby is nothing. Right. To somebody of lower income, it's like 6 years of wages. And it's just, I don't, of course, what you said is right. I mean, this is just, the press release is just something they constructed to say, but I still think, it should be open to critiques of this sort.
Well, I think it's obstruction of justice and would be. And I think it's worse than what Clinton did with Mark Rich. At least the Mark Rich thing was sold for something, who knows what. Here he's obstructing justice. He's protecting people, and the idea that
Wait,
it's
you
an
mean
excessive.
Libby is, or Bush
I think
is?
Bush is obstructing justice. It's a continuing pattern in this administration.
But
It's
not in an illegal sense, right?
I don't know the answer. Is he immune? Clinton all of a sudden turned out not to be immune from or protected from the Paula Jones case while he's in office. I mean, my thought last night, and I'm not a legal expert, is that some Democrat ought to put in articles of impeachment based on obstruction of justice. For this, look at what's going on with the U.S. attorneys that seems to have been orchestrated from the White House. Why was Carol Lam fired just as she was investigating Republican congressmen and their friends in San Diego? Why was Deborah Yang, the U.S. attorney in Los Angeles, offered $1.5 million a year to work for Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher with Ted Olson? I think that there's a cover-up going on here, protecting Republicans and things that they did wrong. And I frankly, I know that Fitzgerald is supposed to be a saint, but I don't really get that. Why didn't he put Cheney under oath and cross-examine him? Why doesn't he make a statement if he thinks that the Espionage Act or the other laws were violated or not violated? Why doesn't he tell us? Is he now going to put Cheney back in front of the grand jury, give him immunity, and make him testify again? I doubt it. I sort of think he's pulling his punches also, although it's hard to explain then why he prosecuted Libby. So I think the whole thing stinks, and it goes along with the refusal to make anything public.
Well, wait a second. You don't think Fitzgerald's part of some plot, do you?
No, but I think Fitzgerald is not being as aggressive as he should be, and he also isn't recognizing the extent to which, in this situation, part of his role is to inform the public about what happened. I didn't like Starr's report on Bill Clinton, but it's pretty hard to explain why Kenneth Starr would issue this salacious report on Clinton and his sexual activities, and we don't hear anything from Fitzgerald about these attempts to discredit somebody who appears to be correct about false statements being used to get us into war in Iraq.
Well, maybe Fitzgerald thinks that Starr overstepped and he's not going to repeat that mistake.
No, it could be, but why wasn't Cheney examined under oath? Why are important people not examined under oath? I don't understand
I do think that in general, Fitzgerald has a fairly conservative conception of his proper role and is not a showboat.
Yes, I agree. Well, I agree with that.
Or at least if he's a showboat, he's a very clever, subtle kind of showboat.
He's a better showboat than Giuliani was.
Yeah, a less obvious showboat.
I agree with that. But I just don't understand what he's doing. I mean, it's the same thing out here in this Barry Bonds investigation. The only useful thing that's happened was the leak to the press that caused the congressional hearings, that caused Mark McGuire and Rafael Palmeiro to testify, that caused steroids to go into baseball. So nobody received any significant jail time, and maybe they'll prosecute Bonds. It doesn't really look like it. But it's important that the public find out what's going on in baseball and in the office of the vice president. And I think Fitzgerald has really fallen down in that function so far. Maybe he has a surprise for us, but he's acting like he doesn't.
Well, he may not see it as his role.
Yeah.
I see one thing you and Mickey have in common. I mean, you said you don't quite see a plot, but you both are inclined to suspect that there's more going on beneath the surface in terms of motivations and interconnected motivations, among like-minded people than is evident. But the kinds of plots Mickey sees are very different from the kinds of plots you see.
I mean, Bob, every time somebody in the government has opened the blind a half an inch, like, for example, when whoever it was gave the first testimony about the U.S. attorney firings, we've seen incredibly improper conduct. And no wonder they want to keep everything secret. So why would you give them the benefit of the doubt? I mean, when Cheney and Bush talk, don't you think they talk about this? Do you think they have some sense of propriety, that it's somehow off limits? I mean, that's absurd.
Yeah, although it may be that Cheney, is perpetrating such an elaborate plot on Bush that he actually doesn't talk much about the operation he's got going on over there, if you know what I mean. I mean, it may not be that Cheney can be nearly forthcoming with Bush, because basically Bush is his dupe. I didn't read this recent series in the Washington Post about how Cheney had managed to acquire so much power, but I do think that there's probably that tension in their communication.
Well, I think, so you're saying that Bush is essentially like his mule who doesn't have to know actually what's going on so they can maintain plausible deniability. Is that your theory?
Not for the purpose of plausible deniability. I'm suggesting there may not be a totally efficient channel of communication between Bush and Cheney, in part because of for Cheney's own reasons. But I don't know. We're getting
I really don't believe that.
Pretty far afield. But, well, do you buy the basic scenario that Bush is Cheney's dupe? I mean,
I don't know that Bush knows it, but I think
that's the way dupes are. They don't know.
Well, somebody said that he had, and I'm not an expert on this, but that he had a liberal lieutenant governor in Texas, and so he was, other than frying 150 people, he tilted a little bit to the left, and he's like an empty vessel. I mean, he is an empty vessel. He doesn't know anything. His idea of foreign travel was going to Tijuana or something like that. I mean, he knows nothing about anything, so he is misconceiving how somebody acts as the CEO. The CEO is supposed to know things so he can make judgments, not just sit there and collate other people's reports and sign them at the bottom. That's what he's done as president, and it's been a disaster. Let me just actually get back to this commutation for 1 second. There are tens of thousands of people rotting in jails who did things far less serious than Scooter Libby, who've received under these sentencing guidelines in federal court, I'm not even talking about state court, incredibly lengthy prison sentences that Bush wouldn't dream of reducing or listening to their stories or worrying about their wives or children. And it's just a canard, and it's just offensive to anybody who's involved in the criminal justice system to think that it's as offensive as thinking Clarence Thomas was the most qualified person for the Supreme Court. It's just nonsense. And it's too bad that the president doesn't actually have an office to exercise some oversight over people who are sentenced and find people who've received excessive sentences and commute them. It's too bad it's just when it's the chief of staff of his conspirator.
Yeah. And actually, I want to make a point about Libby. It's like something I forgot to say when I was last discussing this with Byron York of National Review on Blogging Heads.
He might have been on your other side on this one.
What's that?
He might have been on your other flank on this one.
He might well have been. He was defending Libby, and he was talking about this, I don't know if you followed this, but there was this disclosure that tons of people in Washington had written letters to the judge asking for leniency on Libby's behalf.
Yes.
And Byron was interpreting this as being this kind of, something kind of redemptive for Libby. In other words, evidence that he's genuinely a good guy, as I understood what Byron was saying. And I failed to reply, although this had actually occurred to me before, is that it's true that lots of people had written, credible letters saying Scooter Libby did this nice thing for me. But I don't see this as reflecting favorably on his character precisely because they were all of these incredibly influential Washington people. They're just the kinds of people you would do favors for if your goal were to climb the hierarchy of power in Washington. And I don't think you get points for wanting to do that. And, in fact, if you looked more specifically at who they were, they tended to be either, there were some people who were supposedly didn't fit Libby's, ideological mold. They were ostensibly liberals. If you looked at who they were actually liberals at the neocon end of the spectrum, exactly the kind of people that Libby would hope to win over, and moreover, incredibly influential people who, were literary editors of important Washington magazines and so on. So he was just doing nice things to powerful people. That's not Mother Teresa. You don't get points for that.
The Republican judge was not overly impressed, and I frankly think the judge was. I think this idea that he needed to rat on Cheney explains the length of the sentence. I think the judge probably felt that way too.
Felt what now?
Well, the idea was to put pressure on him to say what actually happened.
Oh, and there would have been that would have been a plausible outcome and a way for him to still avoid the sentence had Bush not stepped in.
That attitude permeates the judicial system in this country. That you sentence the little guy and he rats on the bigger guy. It's almost reflexive.
Yeah. See, but my reading of Cheney is that he would have taken a bullet for the troops because, in his circles in Washington, it would have led to such disgrace. I mean, in the circles he hangs out in, there's no disgrace in going to jail for 2.5 years to protect, your boss and your ideological compatriot. The disgrace in his circles would have been to rat on the guy. So I don't think he would have.
I understand. It was a long shot, and now.
But you may be right that that's what the judge wanted.
I just think they do that reflexively.
Yeah.
All right.
Now you mentioned this Barry Bonds thing.
Yeah.
And you had in email hooked that up to the Judy Miller thing. And one thing, I kind of looked at one of your blog items. Of course, Judy Miller was on Blogging Heads recently, and there was some disgruntlement about that among some viewers. But,
I thought she did a good job, and I think her article's interesting, and I think she was a good reporter who had interesting things to say before she, took a wrong turn. That's my view. I mean, I listened to her talking about germs, during the anthrax crisis. I thought she knew a lot more than I did.
Well, yeah, and so you read the suicide bombing article that was the occasion for her doing that interview on Blogging Heads?
Yes.
I thought what was interesting about that was...
We'll get back to Barry Bonds.
Yeah, we will get back to Barry Bonds. We'll do that second, but it was not the predictable ideological take. It seemed to me, first of all, not obviously right-wing, and moreover, to me, seemed... incompatible with a left-wing take. And I meant to say this last time when I was discussing this with your brother, but we got all wrapped up in the whole question of whether, she should have been on the site and so on, and didn't get into the substance, which was actually the reason, I thought it made sense to have her on, because the substance of the piece was very interesting. And
what do you think her take was? I thought even more so after listening to her on Blogging Heads that she presented it sort of as a conundrum rather than really having a take.
I don't think she leaves it with a clear ideological take on it herself. She seems kind of ambivalent and was kind of going back and forth between, kind of stressing the horrible conditions that give rise to a desire to be a suicide bomber, and the need that implies for a political solution, on the one hand, to, on the other hand, more kind of conservative talking points about how you have to be tough. So I don't really think she has sorted it out herself.
Right.
But my mindset going into it was, I had been listening to this guy, Robert Pape, who has this University of Chicago political scientist who's done this quantitative work on suicide bombing and makes this argument that if you look at when suicide bombing happens, it's essentially always in protest against foreign occupation, whether it's, American troops in Iraq or American troops in Saudi Arabia maybe at one point, or Israeli troops in the West Bank or whatever. And I actually think he takes it too far in his emphasis on occupation per se. But the really interesting thing I took away from his work at a more general level that I thought Miller's piece was totally compatible with was just the following, that ultimately suicide bombers, in a certain sense, his point is that the motivations of the bombers themselves are almost beside the point, because you cannot be a successful suicide bomber without an elaborate infrastructure behind you. There has to be this organization that kind of cultivates the suicide bombers and deploys them and equips them. And there really needs to be a sympathetic community as well to help put them in the mindset. But certainly, just at the logistical level, they need a serious organization behind them. And Pape's point really is that these organizations that deploy suicide bombers always have political aims. And if you're going to react to them intelligently, you need to take that into account and ask yourself, what are their political aims? Is it possible to put an end to all of this by thinking seriously about whether some of their political aims could be realized at no great expense to us, and so on.
Right.
And the point is just that it's just to get away from this idea that, kind of, what is it that makes these people so crazy that they'll kill themselves? Well, it almost doesn't matter, and B, thinking of it as a crazy thing counterproductively distracts you from the actual fact that there's a logic behind it that you can, in principle, analyze and address on its own terms.
It's not recreational. There's a purpose behind it. It's a tactic that you or I have a difficult time understanding.
Right.
But, you know, we send people off to war and they die on behalf of our country. They're not committing suicide, but they're putting themselves at risk. And people are considered heroes if they, you know, knowing that their bravery is probably going to cost them their lives, they go and do something, saving people's lives or saving some piece of cloth or something. So, I mean, we value sacrifice of people's lives for a goal. We don't know that we would do that ourselves.
Well,
but you're right. It's why are they doing it, and how do we create a situation where people aren't motivated to do it?
I mean, the distinction people would make in response to what you just said is, well, yeah, but these people purposefully target civilians, which does distinguish them from the kinds of suicidal missions you're talking about.
Yeah. That's the part we have a hard time understanding. But
well, although that part itself, in a sense, we shouldn't, because Harry Truman decided to kill a couple of 100,000 civilians purposefully. Right. So it's not as if actually choosing to kill civilians for a larger cause is alien to American history.
Yeah.
But the combination of things, you know, asking somebody to go kill themselves while purposely killing civilians is actually something that's not part of the American experience.
Yeah, well, you know, one of the real characteristics of the present administration is their complete inability to put themselves in anyone else's shoes. And I think what you're advocating is that we should do that and try to... And Clinton was sort of the opposite. And Judy Miller even admits that. She says that the end of the Clinton administration before Arafat backed out was as close as we've come to peace. And that's because he empathized with people and tried to negotiate and find things that would work and try to resolve the problem. It's obviously gotten worse, and it's going to take more than a meeting to get it done. But I think what you're leaving aside the question of whether actual occupation is what causes the problem. Clearly, they're political issues. They're sort of combined with religious issues, although not really in Miller's article. I mean, I don't think they're any more religious than people on the religious right in this country. They're just doing something different.
Another big part of Pape's thesis is that fundamentally it's a mistake to think of this as deeply religious in its motivation. Some of the bombers are very religious, some actually aren't.
Yeah, it doesn't sound very religious in Miller's article. It sounds political.
Certainly one of them was not religious at all, apparently. But look, when you say that Bush's failure is to not put himself in the shoes of other people, you're definitely preaching to the choir.
I know. Well, I'm talking to more than just you, I hope. You do have some viewers of Blogging News, don't you, Bob?
Yeah. We hope.
All right. Not lemon sorbet.
I don't know. We may have already lost some of Mickey's fans. They may be at this point.
No, they're working on their comments even as we speak here.
Well, by the way, did I warn you about comments?
I understand. I understand comments, particularly after listening to your last Ann Althouse David Lamb blog, which was approximately 50% Ann Althouse complaining about the hostile comments that she'd engendered, and the other 50% saying things designed to engender more hostile comments. So I learned a lesson from listening to her and reading the comments.
Was she successful? Did you read the comments?
I actually didn't on that one, but I mean the idea that because the carrots were cut up into sticks, that made it a phallic symbol. What if they weren't cut up into sticks? Then it wouldn't be a phallic symbol? I mean, it's just...
We should fill in some background.
It's just nonsense.
Steve, we have to fill in some background. Right. She was talking about the Clinton Sopranos spoof video.
Yes.
And her take had been that when Bill says, no onion rings, and she says, I'm just looking out for you.
Yeah, she's cutting out
onion rings are, a symbol of, female sexuality, shall we say.
Yes.
And that when she gives him chopped up carrots instead, this is first of all, a symbol of male sexuality, but in emasculated form, I guess, because they're chopped up. This was her, Freudian interpretation of this.
It had nothing to do with eating healthy or anything like that, I don't suppose.
Yeah, I gotta say, I mean, Anne made it sound all, quite straightforward, the analysis, but, I actually had personally never thought of onion rings that way, and I'm not sure I'd ever thought of carrots that way.
Yeah, well, and on comments, at least David Lamb doesn't have to worry about any comments because he didn't say anything.
Well,
Except
maybe
that's
he's just a wise man, because these comments can be brutal, and I contend, I mean, I know you've done some print blog stuff, so you know what nasty comments are like, but there's something about them when people have actually seen the real you talking and they've seen you. There's something more painful about it. Partly because sometimes they actually, make unflattering comments about the way you look and sound.
I'm sure. It's hard to look straight at a camera for an hour here.
I've given up on that.
Yeah.
I don't even look in the camera anymore.
But
that's for CNN. That's for MSM, man.
But this all started.
TV.
Every now and then I'd make a comment like on Roger Simon or someplace, and I'd get jumped on by all these Rambo types who told me I wasn't allowed to talk unless I climbed some hill in Vietnam with some kind of armament on me. So I found it.
And so do I take it that you did not climb a hill in Vietnam?
No, they didn't reach my number, 286.
So you were there for the taking, but the lottery didn't get you.
Yeah, I never had to make any difficult decisions.
I
did get into Bolt Hall without actually graduating from UCLA, which under my theory would have given me a right to get in the next year's lottery had they reached 286.
Huh.
But that was never tested.
I still remember, well, go ahead.
That was never tested, so I went back and paid my $25 in December and graduated in the correct year. No one would ever know if I didn't reveal it.
Yeah, I was too late for the draft. My older brother, I remember when his lottery happened, he was like, he couldn't bring himself to pick up the phone and call and find out what the number was, so I did it for him, and it was a reassuringly high number.
That was, 286, it was unclear, and I actually had a lawyer who knew some things, and the Selective Service really planned to just ignore Nixon's number system and just draft everybody. And that was a case where the Nixon administration actually stepped in and said politically we really can't do that. And so there has to be a national ceiling. And luckily I was above it.
I think my brother's number was in the 280s. What's your birthday?
5th.
Okay. 26th or 5th?
It's a good day.
Well, anyway, but there's a side of, so anyway, I wanted that thing I had failed to say about the Judy Miller issue last time, I have now said, but did you want to say something about the original issue of the Shield Law?
Well, I think it's a very difficult issue. The blog I sent you was about the Barry Bonds situation, and I thought it was outrageous that the Justice Department who claimed to use some sort of screening mechanism and only pursue reporters in really important cases, and they implied where national security was at stake or, terrorism or something like that, decided they were going to subpoena Lance Williams and Mark, I can't get his name right, Wadu of the Chronicle, to find out where they got the Barry Bonds grand jury, or the Balco, I should say, grand jury testimony, which I should say was then published in the Chronicle and led directly to the congressional hearings, which, grandstanding by congressmen aside, really did put a spotlight on steroid use and created a steroid policy that previously had been resisted by people like Kurt Schilling, I might add, and the union. Now he's big, we should test everybody, but that wasn't, I don't believe, his stance way back then. Anyway, that was the good that came out of it. And so why do they need now to, use the reporters to find out who leaked? And Gonzalez said that he personally had approved this and that it was worthwhile. And it just seemed stupid to me. They were just attracting publicity. Well, it turns out that the leak was a lawyer who leaked it to the Chronicle and then went into court and said his client should be cut loose because of all this publicity that the lawyer had created. So there's a little more to it. I still don't think it's worth, since that motion was denied, I still don't think that it was appropriate to subpoena the reporters, but it just shows the judgment that goes into it. And in my opinion, there should be a law that allows judges to weigh that. In the Judy Miller case, some of the judges thought they could weigh the need against the importance of keeping reporters' sources secret, and some thought they couldn't, some thought they could, and weighed it still on the side of the government. That basically was the prevailing view. By the time it filtered out to California, the judges here are pretty emphatic that there is no Shield law, and if the prosecutor, unless you could show they've misled the grand jury into issuing the subpoena, that the prosecutor has a right to get information from a reporter pretty much any time they want. I think that's wrong. I think the judge should, at least the judge, the same reason why they should review a search warrant, should review a subpoena like this and weigh the importance of the issue against the importance of allowing the reporter to keep their source privilege. And if they, weigh in favor of the reporter, then the government just can't have that evidence the same way they can't have evidence from someone's lawyer or doctor or priest.
So the Shield law,
and Judy Miller is Judy Miller is a very difficult case. Also, everybody keeps trying to come up with exceptions that somehow cut out someone who received information from a government source, but none of the exceptions really seem to cut properly, so it puts the right people on each side of the exception. So I come down to judges having to exercise some discretion.
So, but all of this, I mean, the whole reason that a judge could throw her in jail for not talking was because of the existence of a Shield law. Is that right?
Was because of the absence of a Shield. It's You don't want to hear the whole history back to Brandsburg versus Hayes.
So
but
the Shield law would insulate journalists.
There is a dispute as to whether a very divided Supreme Court left any room for any protection of journalists under Brandsburg versus Hayes. The majority in the Judy Miller case either held there was no protection, or if there was protection, that they wouldn't protect them. But the general gist seems to be, and with this Supreme Court, I think we can be assured that there is no protection, and therefore reporters are pushing for a statute that is a pretty weak Shield law, but at least gives the judge the authority to weigh the value of the testimony against the value of the reporter keeping their information secret. And that at least ought to be the law. It's not. There's a case in California, a guy named Josh Wolf, who's found himself subpoenaed to a federal grand jury where there's no Shield law in what seemed very much like a state case. And in California, there is a Shield law, which may or may not have applied to him, but it seemed like the federal government did this investigation at the behest of the local government just so there wouldn't be a Shield law. But then in his case, it's not even clear he's a journalist. So everything gets very complicated, but there ought to, at bottom, be the right of a court to protect a journalist if they think that that's the way it ought to be, and it shouldn't just be up to Alberto Gonzalez.
So do you think we're the first people to connect the Barry Bonds case and the Judy Miller case, or?
No. I mean, the Shield law is front and center in both of them. There's no question about that. The Chronicle reporters still have not testified. I mean, they were ready to go to jail. I hear they weren't very thrilled to go to jail, but they were ready. And as it turned out, the source was discovered and sentenced to. The plea bargain was 2 years, but the judge has actually rejected that as being too light. Maybe the president can commute it. But the Shield law is clearly front and center in both of those cases. Will Barry Bonds be prosecuted? I'm not sure why he hasn't been. There seems to be pretty strong evidence of tax evasion. But we're in San Francisco, and Barry is our guy. He is starting in left field for the National League All-Stars with a terrific come-from-behind victory in the fans' vote, and we're happy, and we don't want to hear anything about.
So he gets no booze at all when he plays in San Francisco?
He gets very few. He's we have a certain amount of drug tolerance out here, but he's our guy.
Yeah, I used to go out and we lived in San Francisco for a few years in a simpler era when I went out and watched Willie Mays play, and Barry Bonds' father, Bobby Bonds.
Yeah, Bobby. I once saw the Giants score 8 runs with 2 outs in the bottom of the 9th inning, with Bobby Bonds hitting a double at each end of the rally on a night when it must have been 20 degrees to beat Pittsburgh. I mean, we were idiots to still be there with 2 outs in the bottom half of the 9th inning, but we saw the greatest.
You know what Bobby Bonds did in his first at bat in his entire major league career?
I'm guessing he hit
Grand Slam.
Really, I should know that.
Grand Slam.
Yeah, that's the kind
I'm not
of
sure
thing
it's been done by anyone else.
There are people wandering around San Francisco with these battered old Giants hats with all these. If you stayed to the end of an extra inning night game at Candlestick, you got a quad at Candlestick. So they have all these quad at Candlesticks on their hats, and they would know that in a minute. But they they know that, and they know how hard Willie McCovey hit the ball that Bobby Richardson caught.
In the 1960
World
what, 3-4 World Series?
62 World Series, and they actually had a reunion when the Yankees came to AT&T Park a couple of weekends ago to sweep the Giants.
Yeah, McCovey hit the ball so hard that Bobby Richardson caught it about, I don't know, 7 feet off the ground at second base, and it probably would have left the park if he hadn't touched it. It was hit so hard.
Well, it has become somewhat exaggerated, but Bobby Richardson did say it was very hard. So
I actually saw that on TV. I'm ashamed to admit. Within the last week, I happened to turn on one of these classic sports channels. But anyway, the key is, I guess, was that the 7th game of the World Series? Giants would have won that World Series had McCovey hit it to most places there were. It was hit so hard he had to hit it right at Richardson for it to be caught. Okay.
Yes.
But we digress. You wanted to say something about we just lost any viewers that were still left, by the way.
Well, there are no sports. Yeah, I'll say this. When I write something about sports for the Huffington Post, it never makes it to the front page. I wrote a thing about back before the World Baseball Classic when the Bush administration was going to not allow Cuba to come here, and they were going to have a team of refugees, like led by Levon and Orlando Hernandez. I wrote a funny piece, the best piece I've ever written about that, and it never saw the front page because sports and politics, they do seem to have different followings. I agree with that.
Well, fortunately, we break these things up into topics, and so people who take advantage of that can pick and choose, and we will segment that baseball reminisce section safely off from the rest. You wanted to say a little something about the Supreme Court is now saying it will look into another one of these Guantanamo issues. Is that right?
Well, yeah, I should just say, by the way, the Huffington Post is treating me very well. For no apparent reason, most of the things I write when I wake up in the morning are on the front page and given prominent position, which I have never quite understood, but I accept.
That was a Mickey-like piece of time release compunction there that we saw at work.
Well, I've only met Arianna Huffington once, so I'm doing this all by remote control. And I can't complain. Anyway, the Supreme Court, after a week that was just disastrous for anybody who's to the left of center, Judge Alito took Judge O'Connor's place, and now Judge Kennedy is the swing vote, and that's not good for free speech and various civil rights, various other things. He always has a caveat and a this and that, and maybe in some case I'd feel differently, but the result has been that school kids, not even in school, can't hold up nonsensical posters because it's got the word bong in it. Although I suspect the word Jesus was the one that bothered people.
That's the bong hits for Jesus case. They were holding up that banner at some sort of school-related function, I guess.
No, they weren't. They'd been let out of school. We'll talk about this. They'd been let out of school to watch the Olympic torch pass by. And this guy out of school, not on school property, although during school hours, holds up a sign that he had seen. Where did he see it? Oh, now I've forgotten. He'd seen it on some absurd place, and he just thought it meant nothing, and he was just trying to be silly, and he ended up getting suspended. Now, I agree that the school principal shouldn't be sued for damages, but I also believe that the kid shouldn't have been suspended, and that it isn't too hard for the court to say that. But anyway, they came up finally. They had enough of the Bush administration, and it's on one issue where they've been actually quite strong, if divided, and that's the rights of Guantanamo Bay detainees to seek access in the United States courts through habeas corpus. There have been a series of decisions, and each time the Supreme Court makes a decision and Congress then tries to take jurisdiction away, they held the first time they found jurisdiction, although they said, well, there's no jurisdiction over the detainees, but there's jurisdiction over the people who are holding them there, so we can listen to a habeas. Then the Congress passed a law and said no jurisdiction, and then the Supreme Court in the Hamden case said, well, you didn't say it applied to pending cases. And then at the last 90 days of the Republican Congress, with complicity of some Democrats, they passed this, and the complicity of Arlen Specter, who said that he would never go for it, which Jeffrey Toobin wrote about in the New Yorker recently. They passed the Military Commission Acts and said it does apply. And so now that they're up to it at the Supreme Court. They have to decide whether under the Constitution, the clause that says habeas corpus won't be suspended, except in cases of rebellion or insurrection. I forget the exact words, but clearly not this. Whether that applies. And the argument is that there's no sovereignty over Guantanamo because it's part of Cuba, although we own it forever. And then they start arguing about whether the habeas corpus would have been applied under similar circumstances when the Constitution was adopted, with the problem, frankly, being that neither side can find a case that is really on all fours with Guantanamo. And it seems like, it's one of these dead Constitution, living Constitution things. Why in the world do we have to have our concepts frozen in, 1786 or whatever? But anyway, they denied hearing in some cases that are pending in the D.C. Circuit, and then the detainees' lawyers, because it isn't always the detainees. A lot of the detainees are, frankly, refusing to deal with their lawyers. But the detainees' lawyers, who are a very heroic group of, in this case, it was largely civilians, the kind that Justice Department officials said their clients might be disappointed if they were representing detainees. But they were very persistent. They filed a petition for rehearing and asked them to grant a hearing, or certiorari, and hold it until the case had been decided in the D.C. circuits and have it in hand so they could immediately make a decision on this constitutional question. And the Supreme Court apparently had not granted one of these since 1947, so it was sort of a futile act, but they did a very good job, and they included statements from people who'd served on the military commissions, and the lawyers who are representing these people have been very articulate. I went to hear John Yoo, and I ended up sort of ignoring him and listening to this public defender from Wyoming whose reserve unit was called up and is representing detainees at Guantanamo. They've been very compelling. The Supreme Court reversed itself and now is going to hear this case, apparently, at the beginning of the next term and decide the constitutionality. And what's interesting is, according to what I've been able to tell, it takes 5 votes to do a rehearing. And so maybe there are those 5 votes to find that under the Constitution there is access to the courts for habeas corpus or its equivalent for these detainees, which is just what the Bush administration is trying to avoid, because they have a process there where the detainees and their lawyers can't see the evidence against them, can't bring in any of their own evidence. There's a presumption that the evidence is true. Hearsay is allowed. And if the court finds there's no right to detain them, they fire the judges and hold a new court and figure out, until they find, sort of like finding Robert Bork to fire Archibald Cox. They keep going until they find someone who will find them properly detained. So it's a corrupt, awful process that holds us up to disrepute in the eyes of everybody. And maybe the Supreme Court will actually do something about it, which shows that despite years and years of efforts, they still can't pound the last nail in the coffin and have the court uphold no rights whatsoever.
Well, and in general, I guess the Supreme Court has, even in the eyes of some liberals, kind of stood its ground on these kinds of issues lately, at least. I mean, it took it a while to kind of get around to it, I guess. But right. But this is, in general, beyond even this particular finding or whatever it was. This is the bright spot from your point of view, right?
Well, the thing, we're back to John Yoo again. He wrote an incredible column in the Wall Street Journal that essentially was a victory dance, saying that Congress had showed it to the court needed to just get out of this issue. This was an issue that was entirely for the Congress and the President, and the court had absolutely no business looking out for anybody's rights or doing anything. This was a military situation. And when I did see you speak, he said as far as he was concerned, these people could be held without any rights at all until the war against terror is over.
Which will be never.
Well, yes. It was clear that would be never. So essentially, that's the hard right position. I mean, that was the most repulsive op-ed piece I've ever read. It's just... among other things, leaving aside the rights of the detainees, what kind of country do we live in, and what are we fighting for if we can just lock people up because the president says so? I mean, that's just not.
Well, the amazing
the way
thing
it's
to
supposed
me,
be.
I mean, you know, in a way, this is an argument you should be having with your brother, but which would be a good blogging heads, by the way. But
yeah, I always thought I'd appear with him instead
well,
of you.
you should. There would be more arguing, that's for sure. Probably about a whole range of things, all of which would be fascinating. But but what really amazed me was that for the longest time, the people who were being deprived this kind of due process, or the person who was being one person who was being deprived due process, including the right to consult with the lawyers, I understand it, was an American citizen, right?
Yes.
That's Jose Padilla, right? And,
yes, there are all these distinctions
and that,
about
to
that,
me,
yes.
was stunning, and it went on and on and on, with really fairly few influential people complaining about it. Finally, through some process I don't recall, the side of Wright, you know, prevailed, as I dimly recall. But I mean, for the longest time, the Bush administration was saying basically, look, I am George Bush, and I have the right to go into any house in America and arrest anybody I want and put them in jail and not explain and not let them see a lawyer and not let them have a trial, and that's because I'm me, right? I mean, that's really not a caricature of what the implications of that case were, right?
Right, and what happened was they ordered that he should have a lawyer, and then the government dropped the proceeding and indicted him in Florida on something else.
Right, and so, I mean, slowly, kind of, there has been this drift back towards sanity, but I've got to say, tell me if I'm too cynical, I really think that if, I mean, the Jose Padilla case, finally, the Supreme Court itself weighed in on the side of what you and I would consider right? Now,
right.
I really, tell me if I'm too cynical, I think that if 6 weeks before that ruling was rendered, there had been another 9/11, we would have gotten a different ruling.
Well, you know, we don't know that. That certainly is. You know, if you go to law school, you find that the rulings during wartime are inconsistent with a lot of things that we think is true. Right. Not during wartime, including the Cold War, some of the anti-communist decisions in the early 1950s.
Or during World War II. But it's hard for us to believe that they actually just locked up everyone who was Japanese American. But during a war, a popular war that has support, psychology just changes and it influences everything. And the first taste I had ever gotten of that was right after 9/11, because the wars I had lived through before were not epic popular wars. Vietnam was not a popular war, you know, and this was the first time I had seen a nation's mindset change in a way that suddenly rulings we would normally call unjustifiably authoritarian would pass almost without comment. And that's why I remain concerned about what could happen to this country if, as is almost certain, I think, we get more terrorism eventually. But
right. I mean, it's trite. But to me, the most disturbing thing are these statistics about people who think Iraq had something to do with 9/11. I mean, people will believe all, and I think the administration sort of soft-pedaled that. I mean, that wasn't their big talking point, really. But that's just what people want to believe, and so I think it's a weakness. You know, we study about it in history. We read about who was it? Richelieu drummed up foreign wars to hold power in France, and we laughed at it when we were studying history. But it's essentially what we've witnessed over the last few years.
So I guess we've established by now that you and Mickey are two different people. You have different views. I would like to ask you a little about how it came to be that way. I'm particularly interested in Mickey's case. You know, I mean, he insists that he is a Democrat in good standing. You know, we could have that argument if he were here. But in any event, he's to the right of you. Now, you know, I guess the question is, you know, what went wrong? I mean, you were the guy's role model, right? In theory.
He went away to Harvard.
You think it was Harvard?
No, I think it was Charlie Peters.
Now, we should say Charlie Peters was, for a long time, the editor of the Washington Monthly, very influential person. He, a generation of journalists, many of whom you've heard of, learned the craft under Charlie Peters at the Washington Monthly. I mean, Mike Kinsley, Nick Lemon, and so on. Yeah. And you know, Charlie was his school, his ideological school was neoliberalism in one of the two senses of the word. In other words, a kind of kind of third way liberalism, a kind of centrist democratic politics that recognized the value of markets and so on, and didn't go, well, tempered some of the tendencies of the left. And
I guess, I mean, I read his tilting at windmills every month because we should say that Mickey left a good government job in the Bureau of Competition of the FTC, working for Robert Wright, to go to work at the Washington Monthly, which is Charles Peters' publication. I don't actually know that Kinsley was ever at the Washington Monthly. Mickey knew Kinsley from school.
He has claimed he has some sort of connection to the Monthly, right? But you may be right.
Charlie. So in any event, he went to work there, I think, for $7,500 a year salary with a Harvard law degree. But I'd read tilting. I read it because Mickey would write in it. And I should add on this journalistic privilege thing, Mickey questioned journalistic privilege with an article called "The Constitution, the Press, and the Rest of Us." That was one of his first pieces in the Washington Monthly. But every month, Peters was just attacking teachers, attacking unions, attacking courts.
He would probably deny that he was attacking teachers, but maybe teachers' unions.
Does it sound familiar? I mean, that's Mickey's whole position, is the teachers' unions, okay, not teachers, but the teachers' unions and unions. I mean, Mickey was on here a few weeks ago, and I believe he was talking about immigration, and he said something about they would have the right to unionize, which would be a disaster. Well, I don't think having the right to unionize is a disaster. We can debate whether unions have, in some industries, have feather bedding and things like that, and work rules that are counterproductive. Whether we need to have unions and industry be more cooperative, but that it's a disaster for the workers if they have the right to unionize, I have trouble with that. But I think that comes right from Charlie Peters.
Yeah.
So that's my theory.
I mean, the funny thing is, some of Mickey's tendencies are, I think, to the right of Charlie Peters. I'm not sure. I mean, I think, for example, on some of these civil liberties issues, that his position is not really compelled by anything in neoliberal orthodoxy. I mean, look, Mickey wants to leave room for, like, torture. He seems to be in favor of ethnic profiling in the case of, screening at airports and stuff, which I think is just a mistake in terms of national security, personally, and in terms of it's giving rise to more terrorism than it prevents. But there's more to it than Charlie Peters, I think, Steve.
Yeah, well, at some point I had to abandon my subscription to the Washington Monthly because my mailbox isn't big enough to hold all the publications Mickey once wrote for. So. Well. But fortunately, he's online now.
Yeah, so I mean, I could be wrong. I don't know the orthodoxy in and out. But I also, there's a rival theory to explain Mickey's conservative tendencies. Okay. And I want to...
What's that?
I want to try it out on you. I mean, it has to do... I mean, I think one thing that often makes people liberals is if, kind of growing up, they are not part of the power structure. So they have this resentment of entrenched privilege, and that informs a lot of their views. Now, Mickey... he and I once had this argument about which of us could make come closer to making a claim of humble origins. Mickey said
we were on the wrong side of the tracks in Beverly Hills.
That's exactly what he said. I said, Mickey, come on, you went to Beverly Hills High. He said, but we were on the wrong side of the tracks. Now, Steve, is there any truth to this at all?
We were absolutely on the wrong side of the tracks, and the fact is that my father was a lawyer. He had just become a partner. He was appointed judge, and judges don't get paid very much. And so clearly in the income department, my parents were at a disadvantage. I don't think it mattered as much then, though. I never really felt. I mean, I had friends that had big fancy houses north of Sunset, and they were fun to go to, but I never felt.
But wasn't your father on the California Supreme Court?
Eventually,
wasn't he Chief Justice? He wasn't.
No, he was for at the end of his judicial career for 4 years was on the California Supreme Court. Most of the time he was on an appellate court in Los Angeles.
But he was no, like, ordinary lawyer. I mean, you know, it seemed...
Yeah, no, he was very well regarded. He wrote very well. He'd gone to school in England, which was an advantage.
Yeah, now this has a lot to do with what one's social stature is. The other thing, you know, I mean, in other words, if one's father is tremendously respected in the community, the other thing is, I get the impression Mickey was, like, popular in high school, and, I mean, you said yourself, he was, like, president of the student body, right?
He was president of the student body. He was a very good student. He got into Harvard. He played, he was on the tennis team.
So he totally fit into the power structure. The status quo was his friend.
Yeah, Beverly High was a...
Hi, Steve.
Hey, Bob. How are you?
Okay, well, for the second straight week, my computer has frozen up at a particular time that suggests that it is God telling me to shut the hell up. So,
well, since I've had a Macintosh for 4 days, now I can say, you should get a Mac.
Well, you can join that chorus of annoying people.
It's very annoying.
I don't deny that I probably should, although I think there's a certain amount of Mac romanticism. I mean, Apple romanticism in general.
I'm not getting an iPhone.
Exactly. Exactly.
Do you have an iPod? That's how I listen to Blogging Heads, by the way, so it's very useful when people introduce themselves at the beginning.
I know,
because
we need to
I'm
do more
on the
than
BART
that.
train.
I often listen myself on MP3 files while taking a walk, and you're right. It's one of many reforms we're going to institute.
All right, so we're going to wrap it up and finish up on Mickey. I mean, that's what we sort of teased.
Yeah, I think God was telling me to quit ragging on Mickey, but with God's indulgence, I just want to go on slightly longer. Do you have any insight into this, like, Ann Coulter thing? I mean, I'm sorry, but does he bring Ann home to meet the family?
I'm not really supposed to talk about that, but there was a humorous confrontation, whatever it was, with Ann and my mother. But
really?
I wouldn't say he brought her home to meet the family.
Really, though?
He's been a friend. He's been a friend of Ann Coulter's apparently for a long time, and in my view, is blind to her character, her public character. I don't know what her private character is like. And to me, you know what she said about you. Have an affinity for terrorists? What did she say?
I think she said I have an affection for terrorists. That was far from the worst thing she said.
Well, the thing I think's the worst is what she said about the widows, the 9/11 widows, Kristen Breitweiser and the others. That somehow just because they were for Kerry, they were illegitimate. And she said, you know, who knows? Maybe their husbands were about to leave them. We shouldn't be so sympathetic for them. I mean, that really was beyond the pale, I think.
But now there are people who hold the view, even though they loathe Ann Coulter, that Mickey is to be commended for being loyal to a friend of his who was, I think, in fact, a friend of his before she said all this vile stuff.
Yeah, I've been loyal to friends, but he really feels this way. He likes her.
Well, it's possible.
I've never spoken to him about her really until last night, and it's clear to me that he considers her a friend, and he thinks that she's being humorous, and you know, Mickey's difficulty is he is not as turned off by right-wing views as you and I are. He doesn't know. Like I said, don't you know the good guys for the bad guys? Don't you know that Scalia is a bad guy? And he said no. And so I just think his antenna set differently.
You know, Steve, I've been trying to put my finger on the problem with Mickey, and I think you've just hit it. He is not as bothered by right-wing views as he should be.
I think
Thanks for clarifying that.
I think you might have known that all along. But I mean, it's true. I mean, he takes things seriously that you and I just dismiss as being right-wing nonsense.
Yeah. Now, but on this Ann Coulter thing, I mean, it's fascinating to hear that there was actually some sort of confrontation involving your mother.
It wasn't a confrontation. Their paths crossed. I should leave it at that.
It was an encounter.
Yeah, it was.
With confrontational aspects.
I don't want to invade anybody's privacy.
I'll tell you, I had joked about unearthing some family secrets while talking to you. But in my wildest dreams, I did not imagine hearing about an actual confrontation between Ann Coulter and your mother, Steve.
Well, you're not going to hear it anymore.
Steve.
You're not going to hear
Talk
anymore.
to me.
No.
Steve, we're
No.
friends.
No,
You
no.
and I are friends.
Nope.
Oh, man. I am so bummed. Steve, I'm refusing to air this dialogue unless you tell me.
No. You suckered me into this because I thought you knew something, and then now it turns out you don't. So that was a very good piece of cross-examination.
Thank you. You know, I could have been a decent lawyer, I think.
I think so.
Well, you're not going to say anything more about that.
No.
But wow, what a tantalizing clue. Do you think your mother wants to do blogging heads?
Well, that would be funny, but no.
I met your mother. She's a very impressive woman. I met her many years ago.
She is. You would think with a son who makes his living writing on the internet that she would learn how to use a computer, but you'd be wrong.
She's a very formidable seeming woman.
Yes.
I mean, very, kind of like regal almost in her air of authority, you know what I mean?
I don't know about that.
Oh, man, she was impressive. If you had told me she was the Queen of England, I would have believed you. Right?
She has
She has a little of that, right?
Yes. But no, she's actually a very informal person and very intelligent. And
definitely intelligent. Do you think she exerted a formative influence on Mickey?
Oh, I'm sure she did. But not pushing him to the right.
No. Quite the contrary, you think?
No, both of our parents are liberal Democrats.
Yeah.
And my mother still is.
So now we started with one mystery. Why did Mickey drift to the right? And now we have two mysteries. Why did Mickey drift to the right? And what happened in this encounter between your mother and Ann Coulter?
Nothing happened.
And I guess we're going to leave with those mysteries unresolved. Is that your position?
I'm in trouble. Yeah. I shouldn't have
well,
suckered
okay.
into that one.
But you've done good work to get us that far, Steve.
Well, all right.
Thanks. And one great idea emerged in the course of this, which is why not you and Mickey dialoguing?
Well, that would be fun.
That would be great. That's great television. And that's what we're here for.
If I didn't screw this up too badly, maybe we'll even be in the same place at some point. But that would defeat the purpose of blogging heads, as I understand it.
You lose some desirable properties of the production if people can actually see each other. But we can work with that. We can work with that if you want to do it that way. Whatever. But I think I think reuniting the Kaus brothers should become one of our main corporate goals here.
Well, hopefully we've discussed some other matters that are of somewhat more
also important. Yes. Now we've covered the waterfront.
Also important. That's fair.
And I appreciate you taking the time.
Well, I appreciate your having me, and I've enjoyed finding out about this impressive technological setup here.
Isn't it amazing? You'd buy stock in this company, wouldn't you?
I think it's a worthy successor to Rube Goldberg, but it seems to work.
Hey, it gets the job done,
Just to tantalize people, there are 2 Dixie cups and a length of string involved in one of the connections here.
But did we make you pay for them? No, we sent them to you, did we not?
I did have to go out and pay $27 to get an earpiece for my
The Scotch
telephone.
tape was lost in the mail, okay? But the cups were free. All right. Well, I think you've said quite enough about our operation, Steve, and we'll be winding it down now, all right?
All right. It's top secret.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot.
Well, thanks, Bob. So I'm supposed to hit stop.
And you can hit stop
we
now,
say
yes.
goodbye. All right. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.